Do you feel distanced from God since the death of your child? Do you wish that there was someone you could talk to who understood the pain of this unique kind of loss? The Present in the Pain community is an online group of Catholic women who have experienced pregnancy and child loss. Come and find the support and understanding that you need to heal. Visit EileenTully.com and click on Community. Welcome to the Present in the Pain podcast, a weekly show that looks at the experience of pregnancy and child loss through the lens of the Catholic faith. I'm your host, Eileen Tully. This is the Present in the Pain podcast, and I'm Eileen Tully. And today I am joined with my husband, Patrick, for a series on the 7 Sorrows of St. Joseph. Patrick, why don't you say hello?
Hi, Patrick Tully, and I look forward to speaking with you all.
If you are just tuning in and you haven't heard our story before, I will just give a brief recap to say that our family has experienced 2 early miscarriages, and then we lost a set of identical twin daughters, one who was stillborn and one who died after 47 days in the NICU. So one of the things that we noticed not too long into our grieving is that men and women grieve very differently. And I was a little bit surprised by the way Patrick grieved, and maybe he was a bit surprised at how intense the grieving was for me also. But one thing that I've heard over the years as I've been doing retreats and speaking to other women who have lost children is, what is there for my husband? What tools are there? What resources are there for husbands? Because of course these husbands are grieving too, but honestly, there wasn't very much there for either of us at the time of our loss, right? Would you say? I think that our church was, they were wonderful about the funeral and burying our babies, but then after that, we were sort of left on our own to navigate the weight of our grief. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything concrete or structured that allowed us to get through our grief. So I think this opportunity is well worth it, even to the extent that this is maybe a partial framework to help other husbands support their wives and their families and themselves through the loss of a child.
Right. So when I was trying to, we really were just sort of floundering our way through this. We had been lifelong Christians, at least, and I was a Catholic convert. And so we really had a firm foundation of faith, right? Would you say? So I wouldn't say that our faith in God was shaken, but our relationship with Him changed. At least mine did. And as I was trying to figure out how to deal with just this crushing grief and the way it just permeated so much of my life for so many years, one of the things that I found helpful was when I learned about the 7 Sorrows of Mary. And so I was preparing a lesson for my children, a homeschool lesson, and it was her feast day. And because I'm a convert, sometimes I'm learning about the saints right along with them. So I was just preparing a lesson for them and reading about what the 7 Sorrows were. And as I read them, I was just... for some reason, right away, I just felt like the Holy Spirit was prompting me that I wanted to look into this more and spend more time with it. So I did do that, and I found that as I put myself in Mary's place in each sorrow, I could identify an emotion that she was likely feeling that related to my own experience of loss. And not too long ago, I found this book called Befriending St. Joseph by Deacon Greg Condra. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. The subtitle is Finding Faith, Hope, and Courage in the 7 Sorrows Devotion. And he's talking about the seven sorrows of Saint Joseph, which I actually only learned about not too long ago, maybe a year ago. And so I bought this book for my husband, wondering if maybe it would be helpful for him also. And what the deacon does is unique in that he sort of, obviously, St. Joseph doesn't have a lot of advice to give us with words in the scriptures, but he leads by example. And so what the deacon does, interestingly, is that he sort of writes like a bit of fiction, but like sort of sets the stage for how Joseph might have been feeling for each of those. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I think really just identifying Saint Joseph as the silent saint, right? Like there's no direct reference to him. There's no quotes. Like we're left with the reality of him as the Father on earth to our Lord Jesus Christ. But I think understanding his role in the Holy Family as the silent saint is context, I think, very specifically for those of us supporting our families through the loss of a child. So we'll definitely get into the details, but there's a lot to unpack.
Right. So I thought today we would just briefly list those seven sorrows. Can you open to that page so we can read them all? I'm not as familiar with them as you are. Okay. So the seven swords of sorrow for St. Joseph are, number one, Joseph decides to divorce Mary, a matter of trust, it says. Number two is Joseph sees Jesus born into poverty. Number three, Joseph sorrows at the circumcision of Jesus. Number four, Joseph hears a prediction of suffering. This would have been the prophecy of Simeon. Number five, Joseph flees with his family to Egypt. So these last two are two of Mary's sorrows as well. Number six is Joseph makes the dangerous journey back to Israel. And number seven, Joseph searches for the lost Jesus, which is also one of Mary's swords of sorrow when Jesus is lost in Jerusalem. So what do you think, love, is the biggest thing that men struggle with in watching their wives, or just in the loss of a child? What was the hardest part for you?
Well, I think to start off with is the reality that a mother's bond with the child is innate. It is hormonal. It is tangible, palpable. She has
biological. Yeah.
She has the reality of a baby inside of her, and from a husband's perspective, or at least maybe I could say from mine, we're not as close to that, right? We don't have the direct experience, and I think it's fair to say that we don't have that bond. I think a husband grows to be attached to the future of a new child. You get excited in anticipation of the child. You start to plan your life around this new child that's coming.
But you think maybe that happens like a little bit later for the husbands? Because I know, like, for women, as soon as we get a positive pregnancy test, we are just thinking of the future, right? Like, we're thinking ahead and planning, and we even like walk differently. Or I notice, like, I always rub my belly. Like, I just think like there's someone there, right? Like, and it's almost like my little secret, or our little secret. Like, but I instantly feel protective of that little one that's growing inside me.
And indirectly, then, I think my outlook and certainly my emotional perception early on is in support of you as the mother, mm-hmm. right? Like, I'm immediately starting to plan and prepare to be able to support you with a new child, right? So, making sure that the house is ready, making sure the nursery is ready, all the pragmatic thoughts and anticipations. What do we need? How do I support you? And then, certainly in the physical challenges that you have, especially late into the pregnancy. Just trying to take over as much as I can, in terms of the day-to-day tasks,
Right.
so that you're not physically burdened beyond, carrying the baby. So there's all of that. But then I'm going to shift gears and say, there's that anticipation, and I think the wife is much closer to the child. But when there is a loss, I think that's when we can most closely relate, I think, to Saint Joseph, especially considering him as the silent saint. Because without that bond, for me, I would say that almost the greatest sorrow was witnessing the sorrow that you went through. It was, I certainly was sad at the idea of a loss. And I would, there's a big spectrum here, I think, with the combination of all four of our losses. So when it is a miscarriage early on in the pregnancy, didn't have as much of a direct impact as did, say, our twin daughter, Bridget, who I actually got to hold, who lived for 6 weeks in the NICU. Like, when she died, that was...
Well, you had bonded with her a bit more.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you had that experience of holding her that a miscarriage doesn't offer you. It doesn't offer the mom either, but in some way she did hold the baby, right? Like a little bit. So, right. So then the experience, well, and then I know that there are some men and even some women who maybe don't feel as upset by a miscarriage as they think they should, or they somehow... One thing that I learned in grieving is that there's no shoulds, right? Like you feel what you feel, and you can't... There's nothing wrong with how you feel. But one thing that I noticed is that, well, grief necessitates a sort of selfishness, and I've mentioned that before. Like this is like a foreign thing for us as we experience this, and we don't really know how to navigate it. Even if we have, like, you had already lost your father by this point, or I had lost an uncle and a grandfather, like grandparents. This is a whole different kind of grieving, right?
For sure.
And so we, as we are sort of trying to figure it out, and it just hits us like this heavy weight. And what we have to do is almost just, as much as we leaned on each other as a couple, we also sort of had to figure it out for ourselves, right? Like, I had to figure out what I needed. I didn't know, like, minute to minute sometimes, like, well, day to day, what's this day going to bring? What's this hour going to bring? So I almost couldn't tell you what I needed, and you couldn't tell me what you needed, because we just were figuring it out. We had to give each other, I remember just having to give each other, or at least, I should say, I remember you probably having to give me a wide berth, right? Like lots of space, so that if I just had this day where I wasn't functioning, you just picked up where... Yeah.
No, and like, I guess to really be candid, my impulse was to get back to work. Mm-hmm. Even in the face of the worst tragedy.
Right, like after a few days, I mean, like within the week almost, or like maybe a week later, it shocked me, because I just thought I can hardly even function to get through the day. And we had 3 little boys at the time when the twins died. And, the idea of just like making decisions about meals and them bickering over who gets what sippy cup, they grieved, but they were so little that they didn't really feel the loss like we did. So Patrick why do you think you needed to get back to work? Like, why was that your impulse?
It's funny. I was recalling too. My dad died when I was in college, and I remember he died on a Friday night. And at the time, I was a bank teller, and I went to work Saturday morning, like much to the shock, I think, of my coworkers at the time. But it was it was a distraction, I think, ultimately. You could sit there and dwell on the pain and the grief, or you could just it was a distraction for me. It was a way to distance myself from the pain of the emotions associated with death, and a way to work through it. That was all. And I can't, like, in retrospect, was it healthy or not healthy? I'm not one to say definitively. It's just how I coped.
Yeah. Yeah. And we do, I mean, so I think that the, what's the word that I want? The impulse is to just push down and move on, right? Like, because in my experience, I think, and I don't know if other wives have probably noticed this, but like sometimes you come to your husband with like just a complaint about what's going on in the household or in your day or in your social circle or the family or something. And you just want to vent, right? Or you just want to share with them what you're experiencing and how it's frustrating you. And when you hear that, what do you want to do?
Well, no, I think you were looking for me to say, I want to avoid that. I don't.
I was thinking that you wanted to fix it. Like you
Oh,
just,
yeah,
like
that's
you don't
what I was
want to
gonna
just
say.
listen empathetically. It's not your first impulse. You've learned probably over the years that I need sometimes just vent and have an empathetic ear, but
Yes.
sometimes you just want to fix it, right? Like,
Oh, but that, like, I'll take that and put it into the full context, and that is the hardest part about losing a child for me was the feeling of helplessness, both to mitigate my wife's grief and sorrow. Like, I just remember when our daughter Bridget died, just saying over and over again, babies don't die. Babies don't die. Like, how do I fix this? Like, this shouldn't be happening. And so my heart goes out, and I hope what we're sharing here today can help fathers really put it into context that you're not alone in the path. I think we all have to face it and walk it, and I do pray, that this is something that very few fathers have to go through. But when you face it, just know that you're definitely not alone. And I don't think there's a right or wrong way to get through it. But I will say that I don't know how you get through this without faith. Because if you can't see the hand of God in all aspects of this and understand, first and foremost, that your child or your children are his children too. And I remember very definitively seeing how people become very angry and bitter in the face of that loss, or turning it over to God and recognizing that his purpose behind it is to lead to the best possible outcome. And it's a very difficult choice to make, to not choose to become angry and bitter. I have the utmost understanding and empathy for those that do. But there's another side of this.
yeah, and that is not to say that anger isn't part of the grieving process, because it is, whether it's just, when we're not at our best, like we talk about being hangry, right? Or we're angry when we're tired, or we're just snippy and irritable, right? Like when we have other things going on and we're not doing our best, anger tends to be like our what spills out of us, right? And so anger is part of the grieving process, but you're talking more about sort of like holding on to just this resentment or this anger at God for letting this happen, and now you just sort of look at the world through a bitter lens, and we don't want to do that, right? Obviously, St. Joseph is our example for not doing something like that. So
And well, I was just going to put it into the context of the meditations offered in this Befriending Saint Joseph. So when you look at the first one, Joseph decides to divorce Mary. Like, again, hopefully this is an obvious story to everyone, but understand that Mary became pregnant before they were living together, right? Like before they had consummated the relationship. Right. And so by all appearances, Joseph could only conclude that Mary had cheated on him, right? Like, so the feeling of betrayal must have been gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. But it says very early on, he wanted to divorce her quietly so as to avoid to bring shame. And like that, I think, is very profound. And it means even in the face of that pain and that heartbreak, he was still willing to sacrifice himself, to lay down his life in that way to avoid unnecessary shame and ridicule being placed upon Mary. But it wasn't until a dream and the angel came to him and said, no, God is the Father. Like,
yeah.
Stick with this, like, see it out. And I think that's the benefit of faith, to see that in the midst of pain, in the midst of hardship, that God is with you and God is using it for a greater purpose.
Yeah, and I thought when you were saying that, I was thinking betray. You said betrayal, and I thought, goodness, like for some of us, isn't that how maybe we felt like God betrayed us in our, you think you're having a pregnancy, you think everything's going fine. We thought we were going to have twins, like we thought we were going to have 2 girls added to our 3 little boys at home, and then it was just like almost. You're tempted to think it was a betrayal, but just like you said, like Joseph just drew on his faith to be able to push beyond that feeling of betrayal and still love Mary so much that he wanted to, like the love trumped the feeling of betrayal, right? So that he wanted to divorce her quietly. So it seems to me like an example of being able to trust and love God above feeling like he stabbed us in the back or betrayed us with this pregnancy, right? Like maybe we lost our pregnancy and we feel like he gave us like the flim flam, like why did I even get pregnant if I was just going to lose the baby? Like, why did you do this to me? It seems like the default response, but to push beyond that and still love him. And it is, that's a valid feeling. Like why I remember feeling that. Why would I have twins and then lose one and then lose the other? We still just had our 3 babies, like our 3 boys. So why would we have to go through all that? But like Patrick said, like ultimately God, his work is always for our best, even that horrible thing. And he's always wanting to provide opportunities for us to grow in holiness so that we can be with him and like him.
And the further point in the midst of my grief was recognizing that as a father, my number one priority is to do all I can to put my children on the path of faith to become saints, right? Yeah. So if we have lost a child prematurely, or as an infant, or at any stage, we hope and pray that we've put them on the path of faith. But in our situation with those young children, right, there can be no doubt that they're in heaven. There can be no doubt that they are now saints. And in that sense,
you succeeded.
We hit the nail on the head. Like I got children to heaven. And I think there's huge comfort, or at least there was for me in that realization.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so what do you want to share with us from the first Sword of Sorrow? Was there anything, I know you wanted to share something from the book about it.
Well, I think, the fundamental principle there is, I think, abandoning yourself to God's will. Because if you really put yourself into the potential emotion that Joseph felt, and I think betrayal is probably the most apt and profound emotion that comes out of that circumstance. He's feeling utterly betrayed by Mary. And then the angel comes to him and says, wait. Like, the Holy Spirit has been at work here, and you have to trust God. And he says, okay, like, talk about doing a 180 and absolutely jumping off a cliff, in terms of that faith. It's real, it's profound, and that's exactly what he did. So I think that's as good a starting point as any in terms of walking through these 7 sorrows of St. Joseph. But, from betrayal to abandonment to God's will, clearly he had the benefit of an angel appearing to him in his dream, to really lead him in his faith and his ability to do that 180.
Yeah, I think that would have helped if we had that.
Right.
Don't worry, guys. God's totally at work. It's okay.
Yeah. But I think, especially finding some downtime in the midst of your grief, and we went to Mass today, and that was something I repeated to myself that I've just started doing recently. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. How is God calling you in the midst of your grief, and where is he leading you to? And it's putting your faith in the belief that God has an end in mind, has a purpose that he's drawing you to.
Yeah, and asking him, what are you trying to teach me in the midst of this pain, right? So I think that's a good place to end for this week and just reflect. One of the reflections that it says here at the end of this chapter, it just said, the reflection questions just say, in which circumstances of my life do I have a hard time trusting? What do I think has caused me to be untrusting in those situations? So if you are obviously experiencing a loss, this would be just a perfect example of just, this looks terrible. Like, at face value, this looks absolutely terrible. And what can I do to look at this through an eternal perspective, right? Like, and how can I look at this and find maybe God is trying to show me something. God is trying to teach me something.
And I think, in closing, again, to quote from the book, trusting Joseph. When I receive news I never wanted to hear, help me to open myself to God's will. Comfort me in my fear, console me in my anxiety, and remind me in this fallen world of God's never-failing grace.
Amen. Well, this is the first in our series of 7 episodes on the 7 sorrows of St. Joseph, and Patrick will be joining me for each one. And I hope that this has been helpful for you and that you'll tune in for the other 7. If you're not already subscribed, the other 6. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, please hit subscribe and maybe leave a review, because that will help other people to be able to find it. But until next week, I'm Eileen Tully, and
I'm Patrick Tully.
And I'm so thankful you're here.